Hi everyone, Timothy Ferris here with a few words about news. I'm going to define news as fresh information that people in a given audience need to know or want to know. Sometimes the two are combined. If there's a hurricane bearing down on your community, you both need and probably want to know what's happening with it. But it's also an editor's or a producer's responsibility to give prominence to news that the audience needs to know, even if they don't necessarily want to know it. And that's the nexus of a few things I want to say in this brief talk about journalism. News is gathered and reported by journalists. The term comes from the French. It means of the day. It's like a journal that one typically would write in each day, what we call a diary. And journalists are professionals at gathering and reporting the news. Journalism is a unique profession in that you can't really license journalists because the First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech, and you don't want the government in a free country doing what many unfree governments do, which is to license journalists and then snatch away the license of anyone who reports anything that the government would prefer that the people didn't know. I'd like to start with a medium that's becoming obsolete but tells us a lot about the nature of journalism, and that's the daily newspaper. This is today's copy of the New York Times, newspaper that I've been reading on a daily basis for more than 50 years. I realize that newspapers printed on paper are on their way out, and that digital readership more and more is the case. But this is a technology that started back in around 1609. I read some sources that said that it was Galileo's publication of his book, The Starry Messenger, explaining what he was seeing through his telescope. It became a bestseller, and it alerted potential editors and such that there was now an audience consisting of enough literate people who wanted to read stuff like this. In any event, the first newspapers were founded in Germany around that time. Newspapers became popular reading in coffee shops, and people would go drink coffee in the morning, read in the papers, and talk about it. An expression of free speech that was declared illegal in every venue in which it was attempted, from Turkey to the United Kingdom. But ultimately failed in all those because prohibitions fail. Government can prohibit whatever they want, but if people want to do it, they'll find a way. And we've had a combination of newspapers and coffee shops ever since. Newspapers evolved over the years a structure that regular readers learned to recognize. The story on the top right, for instance, is what the editors consider to be the most important news of the day. The one on the top left, the second most. And then one goes on down below the fold, as it used to be called. Better, stronger news here, less immediate down here. The placement of these stories on through the paper are editorial judgments by professional journalists. And that's what I like about newspapers. One of the problems I have with digital sites, including the New York Times digital site, is that they seem to be driven by algorithms that are, in my opinion, overly concerned with what the audience comes into the website already wanting to know. And that turns out to be largely opinions. The op-ed page opinions seem to be a very important or popular part of the New York Times, whereas from a news standpoint, they could be discarded. The New York Times decades ago didn't even have an op-ed page. Now, I've written for the op-ed page of the New York Times and other newspapers. I'm not objecting to their presence. But when you go to the digital world, you find that these opinion pieces have bubbled up to the top as if they were on the front page of the paper here, which isn't where they belong. Opinions are not terribly important. One doesn't really have to have any opinions at all. What matters are facts. My journalism students used to come in eager to express their opinions, and I would tell them, if you think your opinions are valuable, try selling one. You can sell facts, however, and that's because in the long run they're much more important. So I would hope that as newspapers continue to move more into the digital universe, that they won't just be responding as if they were only a consumer product, but would continue the tradition of having professionals determine what are the most important stories. They're not going to suppress a story that is important to an audience. They'll make mistakes, but that partnership between the editor and the publisher and the reader can really help improve the extent to which one is informed by one's news sources. The great strength of a professional organization is they can do things that amateurs can't do. Below the fold here on today's paper, for instance, there's a story about that condominium collapse down in Florida. And this story has been in the works for weeks, turning inside the first page to see some more about it. I read here that the Times assembled a team which included journalists from the graphics and national desks, including 2 editors who are trained architects, collaborating to review the original designs and to construct a 3D model of the building, examine videos, engineering reports, 911 calls, and photographs to glean details about what might have gone wrong. And it appears from this reporting, provisional as it is, that what went wrong isn't what you might automatically assume in a cliched sense. It doesn't appear to have been corruption, people wanting to save on construction costs. It seems to be a more complicated matter of enforcement of building standards and a slowness by part of the residents and the city alike to realize that saltwater erosion had rendered this building dangerous. Now, a growing number of people are getting their news, or what they call the news, from the internet, where falsehoods spread 6 times faster than facts, and where there's always a site that will confirm your instincts or your opinions, but very few relative to the many amateur sites that will give you any fresh information or a logical basis for these opinions. So the internet as a whole is a wildly unreliable source of news. The cable news, 24-hour news broadcasts that you get with basic cable are pretty weak broth. When I see people on social media complaining about what they call journalism or newscasting, they're almost always talking about 24-hour news operations. And so I want to suggest 2 things that are just a matter of my opinion, my experience as a journalist and a writer, and that is, first, get your news from professional sources. And second, try to read as much as you can, because reading comprehension counts for so much more than just hearing something. I know for a fast-breaking story that you can see something on the cameras, that's great. But if you want to understand the news, you need to spend a little more time, go a little bit deeper. It's not a huge amount of time. You don't have to read 3 papers every day the way some of us do. But gawking at somebody on a TV screen or a computer screen simply saying something to you won't do much to help in comprehension of the news or the wider culture from which the news arises. When Walter Cronkite was doing his famous evening news broadcasts, so much looked back upon and admired today, originally just 15 minutes apiece, he used to point out that our entire newscast, even at a 30-minute length, is less than about a column or so in one issue of the New York Times, or the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal. So do try to read news from reliable sources when you can. And don't let anybody tell you not to. If a politician or a business person tells you that the real news, the professional news, is fake, or that you can't trust this newspaper or that newspaper, that the Times is too far to the left or the Journal's too far to the right, or there's something wrong with this or that other source, they're not trying to tout you on to better news sources. They're trying to get you to not learn any news at all, because then it's very easy to manipulate you. Reminded of a series that the Times did years ago about illiteracy in China. The reporter asked a farmer there a question. The farmer responded to something I've always remembered. He said, you know, when we hear that something has happened out in the world, we don't know, is it good or is it bad? Because you see, we're illiterate. Now, they didn't have any choice at that time and place, but you do. Get your news from professional journalists. Consuming free news only is like saying, I'll only wear free shoes. Embarrassing, uncomfortable, and unlikely to get you very far. Hey, thanks for listening. See you next time. Suggestions for further reading: major newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal. Local newspapers like the LA Times, the Miami Herald, the Santa Rosa Press Democrat. Magazines with excellent and timely nonfiction include the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Rolling Stone, where years ago I was an editor. Finally, let me put in a plug for the best news weekly in the world, The Economist, a genuinely liberal, in the classical sense, magazine with coverage that exceeds in its quantity and accuracy all the other English language weeklies in the world combined.